Welcome. This is something to talk about from the Bainbridge Island Senior Community Center, and it is garden talk time. Vernal equinox just passed. It surprised me a little bit, thanks to I guess
Leap year.
leap year. We had an extra day, which threw off whole uh, our whole simple brain activity. We're going to talk with Ann Lovejoy in a minute. I do like to start these programs by thanking the folks at Fieldstone Communities of Bainbridge Island, which sponsors something to talk about. They offer assisted and independent living in a vibrant memory care community up on Rolling Bay. You can take a tour, stop by, or call. You can call 206-594-1010. You can email Ashley C at fieldstonecommunities.com or look at their website, fieldstonecommunities.com. They also offer day stay and respite care programs. And we are meeting on the ancestral homelands of the meeting and living on the ancestral homelands of the Suquamish people, the people of the clear salt water, who have lived on these waters and adjacent lands since time immemorial. We honor them and we are learning from their stewardship of the Salish Sea and adjoining land space, earth space, growing space. So, Anne, thank you very much for joining us today.
Well, thank you, Reed. Yeah, it's funny because when it's a leap year, that means the spring equinox bumps a day, but it doesn't necessarily mean the fall equinox bumps a day because it's complicated. But yes, a lot of people have said, no, it's always the 21st. Well, actually, it's not. It can be anywhere between the 19th and the 22nd, depending on what the rest of the world is doing. So that's kind of a fun. And NASA has a really cool um, graphic image from space of the Earth at both the winter solstice and the summer solstice and the winter equinox, I mean, the spring equinox and the fall equinox. And it shows you the tilt um, at the solstices, especially. You can see why we have our seasons because the pictures are very clear. My grandkids and I were looking at them yesterday and thinking, wow, that's pretty amazing, really. Um, I wanted to start off with a wonderful quote from Margaret Atwood. In the spring, at the end of the day, you should smell like dirt. And I like that because, for one thing, she talks about dirt, and a lot of people feel prissy about dirt and think they should be saying soil, and somehow dirt is too dirty. But you know what? Dirt is great stuff. And I think we should never be, as gardeners, never be above the dirt, right? We should be right there with it. And yeah, part of the task is to turn common dirt into beautiful soil. That's definitely true. But I love to remember that even common dirt usually has about 400,000 times more biotic activity and diversity than even the best compost we can make. We don't know how to be as good as nature, and it's humbling. It's good for us to kind of remember that and not try to be too bossy out there because nature's already doing a much better job than we can. And our best bet is usually to follow the lead of the natural world. So that said, one of the things I wanted to talk about a little is that we have just come through a very unusual season of this is a dry spring, and it's a weird spring that has, we went from, like, last Thursday, my car was frozen over in the morning, frozen solid, and I couldn't get the door open. But then by the end of the day, it was 60 degrees. And that is a tough swing for people and plants. And so many of the plants that kind of got hammered when it got really cold this winter, and we had a pretty prolonged cold spell, are really not looking that great. And I know that I've said it earlier on some of these programs, like, you got to give stuff time to see if it's going to die off or it's going to spring back. Well, right about now, you can kind of tell if there if there's going to be renewal or not. And my personal feeling has changed over the years. I used to nurse every little thing back as best I could possibly do, whatever it took to bring back this struggling plant. And now I'm not feeling quite that way because I feel like we need to develop a palette of plants that are more resilient as we enter into this new period of climate change and struggle. And we're going to need to know which plants are going to be with us on the journey and which plants are not, and not keep planting the same thing over and over, hoping this time will be different, right? So,
I've just been pulling out a giant flax plant, and I don't know whether I think it just rotted in the middle. It froze so much this year. It
Yeah.
had been very happy for many years where it was, but now I'm going to have a big open space in the sun that I'll have to figure out what to do with.
Well, and what a delightful experience to have garden space in the sun available. That's not something we all get all the time. A lot of us have shady gardens, and any little sunny spot is precious. I will say, when you remove the dear departed like that, and then you think there might have been root rot or there's any mushy slushiness going on under there, dig out some of that soil and put it in the compost, and then replenish it with good topsoil, and some compost mixed together, because the root rots are, this is their place in the world. The Pacific Northwest is prime country for root rots, and we don't want to pass that legacy along. We want to give something a fresh start. So replacing at least some of that soil will give whoever you decide is the new winner, a good start in life, right? A lot of the things like the palm cabbages and some of the palm trees and the, like you said, the New Zealand flax of various kinds are not, have not been able to stand up to the 3 big freeze winters in a row. Like usually it could take one and shrug it off, two, maybe. By the time you hit 3, they're pretty well done. So yeah, digging them up and moving on is probably the best way to look at things. And it does give you a chance to have some new garden companions and think about things you might love to grow that you never had space for before. If anyone has questions, you're very welcome to jump in any old time. You are muted. Uh, so
I think that's the Potters.
unmute. Oh, there you go.
What are you holding up there? A little higher, please.
Fine, you can go ahead and
Okay,
release
you
them. I just
okay?
don't have an idea.
What does it say there?
Oh,
Spider's web.
it's called just spider's web, and
Not
it
that- I don't
was a
think there's a poster, but I
beautiful
think we do
plant.
have an itinerary.
But during that freeze, it looks terrible, but it does have 3 little green sprouts. Is it worth holding on and seeing if it rejuvenates?
Yeah, it's a fatsia, and fatsia is an
Mhm.
interesting. It's actually related to ivy, which means it's tough as nails when it's happy. Because it's
Mhm.
variegated, it's a little bit weaker than the plain green forms, which can get 6, 8, 10 feet even over time. Um, my big fatsia here in the neighborhood really collapsed and looked terrible during the freeze, but now it looks fine again. Some of the leaves are a little burned, but not too bad. So once they're established, they get their roots in and they get some size on them. They're really quite resilient. The one thing I will say is they usually do better if they do not get morning sun in the winter, because if they're come through the night frozen and that morning sun hits them and they start to thaw out, what usually happens is the cells in the leaves will burst, and that is not actually good for the leaves, right? So,
We live on the north end, and we have hardly any sun. So,
that's
but
good. And yeah, you're probably
but
fine
it
that
was
way.
happy. If we were to, like, it has a lot of dead things hanging on it, is it better to take them off or leave them alone?
If they're dead, I would take them off and put them in the compost. I
Okay.
has been waiting to do that because, as you see, we've had a few more frosts and freezes. And
Yeah.
generally speaking, if you leave the top growth on until you're pretty sure we're done with the freezing, any new frost won't. If you cut it off, that exposes a whole new layer of tenderness,
Mhm.
right? And then the next frost can damage that even further. So if you can put up with the tattered look for a little while, and wait until things are a little more settled, that's probably a good idea. That said, I think that we are kind of past the worst of the freezing. I'm just trying to remind myself what the
You
next
probably
few
got
weeks.
all the paper.
Yeah, that if you look down on if you have a phone that tells you the temperatures and things like that, when you see that all the nighttime lows are in the 40s instead of the 30s, that means we're edging up, right? We're getting closer and closer. When the nighttime temperatures are up in the 50s, that's when you can actually plant some of the things like beans that are not happy to go into cool, wet soil. But peas are thrilled. They don't care at all. They're fine with that. Um, that that soil temperature, night temperature link is really important to think about when you're putting in new plants or starting seedlings because the day can be 60 degrees all at once, but if at night it goes back down to 33, that the soil is not boosted up the way you might think.
What
Does that make
about
sense?
like an elevated herb garden? Like, and for thyme, oregano, rosemary, do those have a temperature guideline for planting them?
Well, yeah, the hardy herbs, the Mediterranean herbs, once they're established, most of them can take a fair amount of frost and some degree of freezing. You'll notice some of the rosemaries particularly have uh, there's some very tender forms, like all the weeping ones, like Irene or Seven Seas. All over town, they're dead. They're frozen solid and they're not coming back. The weeping or rosemaries are not very hardy. And some of the other ones you'll notice at the top, all the new growth is burned, but the lower growth looks okay. So those you can trim back the dead parts off and then it will bush out again. In fact, trimming rosemary bit 20%, 25% off the top will make it bush out and be much more dense and bushy anyway. So that's not a bad thing. But a sage is mostly pretty frost hardy. The kind that are uh, what that have the blue flowers and bloom in the summer and gray flat leaves, those are very hardy. The ones with the more colorful flowers are usually um, not quite as hardy as that, and especially the purple leaved ones, sages,
Yeah.
they get fried pretty easily, both with too much heat, weirdly, and too much cold. Thyme, the big enemy with thyme is soggy soil. So especially like creeping woolly thyme hates to be wet and cold. So elevated, as you said, is probably a great idea because better drainage will help it be more accustomed. But they do like all of those Mediterranean herbs like as much sun as they can get and pretty sharp drainage. And none of them do really particularly well if they're in a soggy spot in the winter time.
So these, Kirk just made the herb stand, and so when is it okay to buy the baby plants and put them in it?
You can buy them, I would say probably now.
Yeah.
Especially since the selection kind of goes down. If you feel like you notice it's going to get cold and you still have, don't necessarily plant them, but bring them in or put them in the garage for a few days to make sure that you're going to have day temperatures that are up in at least the upper 40s or lower 50s and night temperatures at least in the mid 40s. Um, But
Okay.
yeah, if you've built a stand and it's up higher,
Mhm.
often you'll notice that there'll be actual freezing on the ground. There'll be frost on the ground and ice in the puddles, but the air temperature might not be freezing because the ground holds cold longer than the air does. And sometimes you'll see that difference and go, why is there a puzzle when it's 34? Um, Ice in the puddle can happen above 32 degrees air temperature. That makes sense.
Amen.
Well, this is, I mean, once established, those kinds of plants are going to be just fine, but it's planting them the first time right now. I mean, I know you have a lot of oregano and rosemary and so forth in front of the senior center, and it looks like it's ready to start going.
Yep, it is starting to go, especially now the oreganos. A lot of times you want to cut them back because they get really leggy and lanky and start spreading and they get real thick stems. So you want to cut all that back so that it starts again from a fresh base. And this is a great time if you want to divide them and make more. You could do that right now, chunk them into pieces and spread them out a little bit. I love oregano for a whole bunch of reasons. It's very pollinator friendly, like, and the bees love it. All kinds of pollinators love it. Birds will come and eat the seeds, which is really pretty cool. I love having birds in the winter garden, and that's why I leave the leggy stems of the oreganos through the winter. But now, now they get cut off at the ground and let the the new growth freshen up the plants. I will say oreganos are pretty rock steady. They also don't mind if they get run over by the UPS truck occasionally. They can take foot traffic, dog trampling, all that kind of stuff. They don't mind that. Thyme, another story. Thyme's much more delicate and a little more fussy because this is really not quite its territory, though that could be changing. Once established, as you say, thymes mostly take the cold in stride as long as they're not in puddles or standing in soggy soil.
So question, what about that sage that you were talking about that made it through the winter? Should I cut that down now?
Oh, you don't have to cut sage down. It's evergreen. And if it isn't evergreen, it's not alive anymore.
No, it's fine. It's fine. So just trim it like I usually would, or use it like I
Yeah.
usually would for cooking.
Yeah. When you
Yeah.
cut some of those things like rosemary and so forth, you don't cut them hard. If you cut
Yeah.
into old wood, they don't usually come back. But if you cut them lightly, that makes them bush out and become
Okay.
more generous. I
Well,
had
maybe I'll
noticed
do
on a
that.
couple sage plants that there's dead stems, and that is from, it looks to me more like root rot than cold. And I
Oh,
think it's because they got too in there in a little bit too soggy a spot, not elevated enough.
yeah. Okay, thanks.
Yeah. The other thing to think about is, of course, spring weeding. We have some very persistent, eager weeds, um, notably the hairy bitter cress family. That's that little one with delicate, lacy little green leaves and a little sweet stalk that comes up in little white flowers, and then they explode their seeds and send them all over the place. And they are incredibly prolific. Let's put it that way. They can actually set seed. They can flower and set seed before they emerge from the soil. And sometimes they do that. So they come up already pregnant and loaded, and then they start shooting off, and they're very explosive. So those seeds just go everywhere, including in your eye, which leads to one of the popular names for it, jumping Jesus, because you start to pull it, it explodes. You go, ah, Jesus, right? Because it's in your eye. But it's also called hairy bitter cress or cardamine, and cardamine, other people call it that damn weed, but whatever. The thing is, you do not want that to go to seed widely because it really can cover a lot of ground, and it's one of those chokers that will smother a lot of other things. So that's one to get the jump on. And when you pull, if you notice there's a lot of seeds, put down a good inch of compost or another mulch to shade it, because those are seeds of disturbance. They like disturbed soil, they like light, and they don't necessarily sprout as well when they're covered up. So just mulching after you've weeded that area will help keep that weed count down a little bit. You talked about how the New Zealand flax, those strappy leaved plants, some of those did not make it. Generally speaking, if you just love them and you really want that look, use the plainer forms. The more variegated, the more colorful they are, the least tender. Those are hybrids of a number of different species. And the most beautiful ones, of course, are the most tender and the least likely to make it through a hard series of years. So if you want it, you can get those sort of olive drab ones. They're very handsome and spiky, and it's a nice upright element. But those beautiful stripy orange and rose ones with the purpley bits,
This
those
was
are,
this was a drab olive one that was very nice, but it didn't make it. I think it's those 3 years of freezing that you were talking about.
yep.
Um, you were just we have these. I mean, they're beautiful bluebell bulb things. I don't know
Oh,
if they are bluebells. They're everywhere. They're all over the garden.
yep.
And then they end up in my compost, and then I spread them everywhere else. And you pull them out, but you can't get down to the bulb.
Right. Well, you can get down to the bulb if you get one of those shovels that Rita and I are always talking about, the root slayer shovels. They'll take you way down. The problem is you can't really tell where they are until they start to sprout. And by that time, everybody around them is sprouting too. So then you run the danger of like cutting somebody in half to get the damn bulb out. I will say you can starve them out essentially over time by systematically letting them grow considerably and then cutting them a little under the soil, and then you let them grow some more, because that's coming from the bulb. But you let them grow to about 4 inches and then cut the whole thing like as if you were cutting asparagus down below the
I
soil.
like this. This is what you talked about with those Himalayan blackberries too.
Yeah, same
You
type
just
thing.
you just have to be persistent.
You have to be implacable, and you have to really, really mind that those bulbs are everywhere. The thing is, the little tiny bulblets that's what gets in your compost. You're right. When you try to dig stuff up, because their seeds are dropping and they're planting themselves all over the place, they're really hard to get rid of. But the best thing you can do is just starve them out. And by making them do all that work of resprouting, resprouting, resprouting. It won't just happen in a year. Um, but yeah, you can do it. It's worth it too.
Yes. Let's see. I had another question about we were talking about, I guess, starting a little herb garden. What about planting lilac? Is it too early if you wanted to start lilac tree or bush, whatever they're called?
Yeah, that's a great question, actually, because one of the things to know is that all the older lilac species, they're big, they're trees, actually. They are generally going to be 20 to 30 feet tall by nature. The newer ones have been bred to be a lot smaller than that, which is good. Even so, to keep a lilac blooming where you can actually smell the blossoms and see them, you if they start to get really leggy lanky, you want to cut every 3 to 5 years, you cut out 2 or 3 of the oldest and earliest trunks all the way to the ground and let the younger ones proliferate. And then you can keep doing that on rotation. You do that with things like red twig dogwoods too. Cut out the oldest and earliest ones every 3 to 5 years, just a couple. So, and then you let it keep coming back. It's called coppicing. And that technique makes for bushy, healthier plants that tend to be not as lanky and leggy and tall. There's also some, like there's Miss Kim, there's a Korean lilac species that is quite small. The leaves are littler, the flowers clumps are smaller, but they're just as fragrant. And they're really cute. And in a small garden or in a container, they're perfect. If you want a real lilac, like your old lilac's getting kind of old, is that it, Reed? Or
Yes, it is, but also my daughter is looking at trying to plant a new lilac, and she was asking about when.
oh,
Um,
this is a great time to do that. You want to give them some space, make sure that they're not too close to the house or too close to a fence, because they go out as well as up, and people kind of forget that. And yeah, they need a lot of sun, and they like drainage. They do not do well in heavy, wet clay, acid clay. They like compost buffering. But their country is like Spokane. That's where they have the lilac festivals and stuff. That soil's a little more alkaline. It drains better. It's not as rich in uh, it's in minerals, but it has more calcium than we do on this side. And so one of the things people sometimes do is make a little bit of a mound bed, like raised bed, not with boxes necessarily, but mound up the soil a bit so that the roots are well covered. They're not standing up above the garden too much, but they have ample drainage because that's a really big deal for them. And you'll see even older ones that have been really well established after a few really wet, soggy years, they'll start to get root rots, and you can pull a whole great big piece like that out with your hand because the whole base is gone. Um, so yeah, younger, newer forms are going to be more resilient and more adapted to this area, and probably less uh, apt to get too tall. But the other thing is to prune them periodically. Like when you pick lilacs for the house, you can go down, not just pick the cluster, but like go down to about 4 feet and cut the branch off there. And then it will start branching lower and then give you more flowers at nose light height instead of
nice.
way up
Yes, yeah,
high.
because it is, yeah, as you know, I have a lilac that's out of over the patio, and the birds love it, the hummingbirds love it, and we love it because it's so beautiful to smell. Um, and yeah, as long as we can keep it before it decides that it's too soggy, I guess.
But that one is a candidate to take out 1 or 2 of the oldest, gnarliest stems to the base and see if you can't get it rejuvenated a little bit, and I bet you could. I was going to talk a little about the big grasses because several people asked about that. We at the senior center, we have those beautiful pheasant tail grasses out in the front and a couple miscanthus, and we let them be all winter because one of the things that can happen with those big grasses is they can rot out too, especially if they've given a buzz cut in the fall. They're vulnerable to that. So we wait until things are a little more settled. And in the last few weeks, especially Rita's been taken and Anita have been helping take down those grasses. And what you want to do with the big grasses is look at the base. And when you start to see the green shoots, cut just above the green shoot. And then it will replenish. And you haven't cut, like if you cut them too low, you're cutting off all the new growth and has to start all over again. But if you wait till you can see a few inches of green at the base, then you cut just above that. And that will replenish that beautifully. You don't want to divide the grasses in the winter, but it's fine to do it now if you want to, and spread them around. You usually have to have if a big clump is getting too big for your space, you want to get two garden forks and go kind of launch it out of the ground that way. And then I put them in the middle really hard and back to back and pry those pieces apart. Or if you can't really do that, you can use a little axe or somebody else's saw. for instance.
Somebody else's saw. I like that.
Yeah,
Yeah, I think
I
you were
actually have a
talking, I
garden
think you were
saw.
talking to Bill Booth at one point when he was sharpening things, and he said, "I don't know what you did with this, but
He said that more than once to me. Like, what are you doing with these tools? It's like, well, I'm getting creative here. But yeah, they're not all built. Actually, Felco, which makes the beautiful pruners, they have a good garden saw and the blade is replaceable because I have snapped more than one of those by trying to do something just a little beyond its capacity. But yeah, you can use a good garden saw and saw clumps of grasses or hostas. Those you can usually tease apart. This is a great time to divide them if they're getting real big and clumped out. Dig them up again with a fork, get as much roots as you can, and then vibrate them, and it kind of the soil will start to fall off. And then you can pull off. It's almost like leeks or something. They have each of those sets of leaves kind of goes down to a base, and you can pull those apart, and anything with roots on it is going to grow on. So yeah,
in your little note for today, you were talking about leeks, onions, and other things that might be good to be planting now."
yeah, and so those that's so one of the equinoctial things that gets planted as roots. So it's for beets, carrots, all the onions, scallions, green onions, garlic, all those things. This is a really good time. We do a lot of that planting at the winter solstice too, of especially the garlic and scallions, and those are actually fattening up and getting ready to be harvested in another few months. But if you sow the next batch now, those are going to be the ones to harvest in the autumn and on into the winter. But yeah, this is a great time to do that. Somebody asked me about growing them from seed, and I'm going to just say you can do that. But when you buy those little starts of onions and leeks and so forth, they're already like a year old. So if you grow them from seed, you're going to wait a while. And it's probably worth it unless you need 200 of them. It's probably worth it to just go ahead and buy some starts. I soak them in cool, tepid water just for an hour or so before, because they've often been bundled up and set aside, and those roots are really dry, of course. And that will kind of wake them up. And then when you plant them, they'll get going a little faster. I also had a question about inoculants for peas. Um, I don't, so the legume family, the beans and peas, a lot of times they're planted after being treated with us with an inoculant to help give them the bacteria, the soil bacteria that they need to make their own roots very productive. So um, I don't usually do peas because peas are really good at that anyway. I just soak peas in tepid water for maybe an hour max. You don't want them to plump up because then they're actually too big and they often will burst rather than do what you want them to do because they've been hydrated too fast. But if you just soak them for like an hour and then plant them, you'll find that they'll sprout a lot faster. And you can sprout peas indoors if you're not sure. Somebody said she kept losing, no peas kept coming, no peas kept coming. And finally she realized the crows were watching her and then going back and eating all the peas. So you can sprout them indoors in little 2-inch pots. And then when they're 4 inches, 6 inches, then you can put them out and they're much less likely to be eaten unless you have deer. But that's another issue. But anyway, I don't usually do inoculants for peas because they do fine in cool soil. It's too cold for beans anyway until the soil gets up into the 50s. And they do benefit from inoculants because they're not as good as the peas at improving soils, in populating soils with the kind of bacteria that help them do better root systems. So you can buy those inoculant powders. Again, you can soak beans in tepid water, just maybe half hour, um, and then roll them in the powdered inoculant, and then plant them. And again, I usually start them indoors, partly just because they're so cute. You know, when you watch beans come up, it's like they spread their wings like little angels. They're so beautiful. And I usually do those in 4-inch pots and let them get 2 sets, 3 sets of leaves, and then put them in the garden. And that with a good start like that, the crow, you're not going to lose them to critters so much.
That was my first experience as a elementary school student,
Right?
right? We used to grow beans in school.
Yeah, because they're so beautiful and they're so easy and they're so, like I always say with kids, it's like big seed, big deed, right? Give the kid a sunflower seed, give the kid a bean, give, right, something that's going to squash. Oh my gosh, right? Something that's going to really be cool and big and beautiful. And then they're apt to eat it and they're apt to really enjoy it, right? Success is always more exciting than
Yeah, you might much higher rate of eating squash if you grew it.
exactly. They usually are. Um, one thing, I've been saying, stay off the soil, stay off the soil. You don't want to compress winter open soil. And that's still kind of true. I mean, really, if your beds are so big that you're wandering through them, they're probably too big and you might want to put in stepping stones or like a little path even. Because generally speaking, walking on soil is just asking for root issues because it does compress it so much. But it's a really good time to go through, and if all those things that had seeds that you left up for the birds, you can now take those down and take them back. And it's sort of fun because it's so much easier to clean up in the spring than it was in the fall, where you had 5 wheelbarrows load of stuff. You might have half a barrel load now because it's all done its thing. Or many people, including myself, usually prefer the chop and drop, where you actually just cut it up with your scissors, your snippers, and let it rot back right where it is and add a little bit to the mulch, rather than carting it off and making compost and bringing it back. Of course, I usually do put things like leaves and grass clippings and that kind of stuff into the compost. You want to build it and have as much diversity as you can, but a lot of times you can just sheet compost with whatever is there, just chop drop, like especially those big sword ferns and things like that. You don't need to take those away. Only take the ones that are sort of heading toward the earth and turning brown, and leave anything that's upright already, because those should last 2 or 3 to 5 years. They don't need to be cut off every year.
It's probably this year I have to do it just for my own aesthetics. Probably the plant doesn't care, but the bottom area all brown and like that. I think it's been a couple of years, 3 years since I've done that, but and just cut it off and put it under where the ferns are, and they'll
Yeah,
be
just
happy.
cut each piece maybe 5 times in little snippets. You could throw a handful of compost over the top of that, or some of those wood chips. And yeah, that's what you have to do, because nature stores all the nutrients needed for that plant in that plant. And so whatever it drops is intended, all those nutrients are first they go back down into the root as the stems dry out and things, but there's still a lot left, especially if it was a leafy plant. And all that you can leave where it is pretty much and just chop. Now, if it's diseased or really mushy or funky or something like that, then no, then you want to take it out and get rid of it. But otherwise, you might as well just leave it where it is and let it do its thing, right?
It is, after talking with you so many times every month, it is painful to watch the yard workers come and scrape everything off of all the gardens, and clip all that. You were just talking about keeping the grasses over the winter. It's like, no, we're gonna turn this into a sterile environment.
And that's not their fault. It's unfortunately, it's what people have kind of learned to want. And it goes to me, it's all about control. It's like if you think that the hand of man and the control over the natural world is more beautiful than the natural world, then you're going to want everything cubed and squared and topiaried and, cut to the bone and lots of bare earth between the plants. That is not natural. It's not sustainable. It's not really good for anything. Uh, except that feeling, I guess, of tidiness. And it's very clear to anyone who knows me well that I'm not a tidy-minded person, especially not in the garden. Because I mean, I just say, go walk in the woods and take a look around, and do you see? It looks beautiful when you see all those layers of leaves have rotted down, the stems have fallen, the lichens are in there kind of going to pieces, the mosses and fungi are everywhere doing their thing. That's an intact ecosystem, or nearly so. We don't really have any truly intact ecosystems on the island anymore, because after it's been clear cut 2 or 3 times, there's not any place that you can see true long-term sustained old growth. But you can see repaired systems coming back. And our gardens don't have to necessarily be like that. But if you do have the fortune to have wooded areas and shaded areas, with beautiful trees, then think definitely about how to do less and enjoy it more. Like focusing on plants that do well in shade. You can go back to those hostas, and many, many bulbs will flourish in shade, right? Ferns will do beautifully. Um, and quite a few other things, epimediums, Vancouveria, Tiarella. There's all these cool things, many of them native, or they have allies and cousins that are decorative too. Like we have native coral bells, and then there's all those gorgeous coral bells you can get now in every color and ruffly shape. Um, but think about making your tapestry of things that don't need to be manipulated a whole lot and don't outgrow their position very quickly. And then you can do less and create much more of a true environment, right? And well knit, constructed community of plants. Just an opinion.
Well, and I like what you said in that opinion about the fact that you can enjoy it more, that you can actually hang with your yard.
Yeah. I think a lot of people sort of feel like it's a chore, like doing the laundry, and because you mow the lawn, it sort of sets up the idea that everything needs to be controlled and everything needs to be whacked in half and all that. And a lot of things really don't. And again, I always like say, go walk in the deep woods, go up to Mount Rainier, go, climb Deer Park or someplace close by, and look as you walk. Look at those environments and think about the fact that the forest rangers do not pack clippers. They don't saw stuff off. They don't prune. They don't dump on fertilizers. They don't take stuff away. Everything just gets to recycle itself right where it is. And, it can't get more beautiful than that. So, studying those natural patterns, I mean, that's what naturalistic gardening is all about, really. It's like looking at the layers that we see of the great tall trees, the understory shrubs, coming down to perennials and annuals, mixing in bulbs and grasses, and you get this great, beautiful tapestry that's all interrelated. And boy, it's more beautiful and it's a whole lot easier to take care of because you're not trying to make it be what it isn't. Right? Working with the nature of the plant and not trying to force a new form on it. Nothing in nature comes in the shape of a cube. It just doesn't.
So, what about people that really fertilize a lot and then they have really big, luscious looking plants? Do you think, what are your thoughts about food, plant food?
Well, so there's a lot of really good plant foods you can use now, like
Yeah.
Dr. Earth is really a good one.
Okay.
There's Whitney Farms. There's several others like that, but those are the ones I probably use the most. When you're using a lot of the chemical fertilizers, what happens is they get rinsed away very quickly, and then they get into the water supply and they end up in this Puget Sound, and then we have problems with the fish and everything else, and algal blooms in lakes and ponds. It's just too much fertilizer is not good, but it's that muchness sort of thing too. You can have big, healthy, beautiful plants without pumping, without getting them addicted to artificial, fertilizers. Fertilizers, as we know them today, were developed after World War II as a way to reuse some of the chemicals used in munitions. And so the agricultural chemicals are actually based on, and that's why you can make bombs out of them. Remember what's his name who blew up that?
Okay, Timothy.
Exactly. So you can't do that with composts. It won't blow up. It's just something to think about.
It might get warm.
It might get warm, might be steamy, but it's not going to blow anything up. So, and it won't end up polluting waterways and it won't end up killing frogs and birds and stuff like that. So, if you want big and lush, you can totally do that. One thing to think about is like a plant in a container that's in a hanging basket or a big pot. It's hostage to you. So it can't really, once it's used up the nutrients that are in the soil that it has, it has no way to access the soil, the deeper soil of this earth to get more. So it's dependent on you, which means if it's not looking big and lush, it's because nobody's giving it the water and the fertilizer help that it needs. It can be organic fertilizer, it can be a natural fertilizer, but it has to keep coming and keep coming on a regular basis. And then those plants will thrive and flourish and look great. Right. But
If you're gardening in a container,
Mhm.
uh, how often do you need to, I mean, do you need to like start from scratch a little bit?
Well, that's the thing. A lot of people have big containers and they plant something and then they pull that out and then they stick something else in the next year, but that soil is done. If you've filled that pot and the pot has been full of roots, that soil is done. So it needs to be taken out, put in the compost, and you start again. And some people are like, oh, it's too expensive. It's like, well, yeah, but so's like putting a big, beautiful, happy plant in old, funky soil, and then it has no where to go, kind of, right? So you have to just steel yourself. Like if you're going to do a big container thing, you got to go through that. You empty the pot, wash it out to get the salts. The chemical salts often build up on the sides, especially if you've been using fertilizers, and rinse those off or scrub them if you have to, and put in fresh soil. I always crock the pot again on the bottom with some broken pots or something to make sure the drain holes are working because you want to fill that up with water. And then fresh soil is you're gonna be amazed how much better your plants will do, right? And in the garden, that's why we refresh every year. You don't have to dig out the old soil unless, like I said earlier, somebody rotted there and it's gross. But every year you want to replenish and you can switch different kinds of compost. I really like the compost that we're getting from Indigo these days. That's been very successful. You can see it at the library. We just got a huge truckload of it. And we put that on all the beds every year and then put wood chips on top of that to kind of protect it from wind and sun and drought and all that.
When you're dealing with the earth like that, the soil, you can, as you described before, just keep adding. You
Yeah.
don't need to disturb the soil, whereas in these containers, you're gonna, by definition, have to disturb it.
Especially smaller ones. I mean, they're captive, right? And if you tip it out and you'll see the roots all through everything, that tells the story right there. That soil has been utilized and it's doesn't have anything more to give. You can certainly, and some people do this, you can keep it going by with the artificial fertilizer thing every 2 weeks, and you water really well, soak the pot from the bottom up. You have to have a deep saucer, make sure that the whole volume of soil is moistened, and then put on half strength fertilizer every 2 weeks. And of course, it gets depleted, washed away with all the waterings. When you buy plants from the nursery, they may have been watered 50, 60 times by the time you get them. So they're utterly dependent on artificial fertilizer at that point, unless you're going to put them in your beautiful garden soil. And then they're going to be able to access the nutrients there. But if you're putting them in another pot, they don't have any, they're just actually dwindling unless they get another boost of help. Because usually in the growing situation, the growers have them on a very regulated schedule of water, light, nutrients, and so they're in prime condition when they come to the nursery. But after they sit around in the nursery, they get watered, but they don't usually get nurtured anymore, right? So then it's when you adopt one and bring it home, it's up to you to take care of it.
So if you live in a forest, can you borrow some of the natural soil and bring it into your pots?
Yeah, it's a little interesting because what you'll discover if you start to dig around in there is it's full. It's already full. Like natural soil in an established woodland is all interlaced. Those trees actually lace their roots together. They connect. There's fungi that are making huge connections there. There's all kinds of plants have interrelated roots. It's almost it's extremely unlikely that you would dig down and find a nice, beautiful, loose place where you could dig out a peck of soil. You're lucky if you get a quart because it's actually doing its job. It's already full. What you can do, of course, is, rake a bit of it off, like especially around a path or something like that. When you're going to expand a path, take some of that soil and add it. It's going to be best for native plants or shade loving plants. It's not going to be good for vegetables and herbs, or even most of the perennial flowers, because they all prefer a soil that's bacterially dominated. And all that forest soil is fungally dominated. And that's what woody plants prefer, right? So, where you put it really depends on what you're growing and who, what kinds of plants you want to have thrive there.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Thank you.
Nothing easy about it, unfortunately. Well, anybody else? I think I felt like I was going to say, oh, I talked about taking hardwood cuttings last time. And so this is when you can, like, if you did that a month ago or so, or 6 weeks ago, um, if you don't see anything happening on them in the next month, they may or may not have uh, been have be functional. But if they're big as your little finger, it can take longer than that. So don't be too hasty to dump them out, but maybe just set them aside where they still get some water and they still get some light, but give them a little more time. Now, some of the ones, things like the hydrangeas, they've probably already got new leaves and you'll see those leaf buds opening already. But
For context, you're talking about trying to sprout something to get something to root.
well, yeah,
You're taking a cutting.
the cuttings, the hardwood cuttings, like I'd say March is ideal. So is October. Those are some of the prime times for taking cuttings of things, um, like roses, like lilacs, like hydrangeas, like a lot of the flowering shrubs and things. Actually, rosemary tips. You can take sturdy tips. You don't want soft, lishy material, but something that's a little stiff and no thicker than your little finger or a pencil. You can cut the growth tips and trim the very top off, stick them in a pot, and often they'll strike, and you'll have more plants, right? To fill in those bare places where somebody died. But it takes a while for them to do their thing. And last month we talked about like starting those hardwood cuttings. Um, but I just wanted to make sure people remember that. I know if you're going to look at this later and you've looked at last month's, that you need to give those cuttings a little more time before you decide they're not going to take.
We post each of these on youtube.com/BI Senior Center. And last week or last month's discussion has already generated a little over 70 views. So people do go back and check or pass them on.
One thing I wanted to add is like several people asked me about, so you buy those darling little tiny miniature daffodils, right? And they bloom their hearts out and then they're done. And people have them in containers with other stuff. And it's like every time you dig that out, you disturb all that soil. And I've talked about this before, but one of the best tricks you can do is a big container. Like I have a big container with a Yuletide camellia in it that blooms in the wintertime. But in front of it, I have 3 empty spaces that are held by a pot, right? So I have pots sunk in the soil, so you can't really see them. But in those slots, I can drop in a pot of daffodils, let them bloom, pull the daffodils out, put in pansies or zinnias or whatever I want later. So you can keep them going without disturbing the perennial or woody plant that you've got in there too. And the other thing to think about is like when those little daffodils are done, you can plant them in the garden anywhere you want and they'll flourish. They're very persistent, those little tete-a-tete daffodils. And also, if you have bulbs that have that are spent and in the garden and you want to spread them around, as soon as their flowers are gone, snap off the what looks like a developing seed head, and then you can dig them up and move them around. It's called dividing them in the green, where their foliage is still green, if it was green in the first place. Sometimes it's stripy or whatever. And that's the best time to move them because they're still alive and they're still doing their thing and they're putting nutrients from those leaves back into the bulb. So you can split up clusters of snowdrops or daffodils or tulips or whatever it is and spread them around. Crocus, easy peasy. And then they'll look, make the whole garden look like a little tapestry.
Well,
I'm
it
so
is certainly.
glad you
Oh, go
mentioned-
ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Diana.
Oh, no, I'm just so glad you mentioned that because I always feel so guilty. Someone gives you those, they look cute for about a week and then then I don't know what to do with them.
They'll bloom fine if they can get a little bit of sun. And lots of times in the winter when the leaves are down of their deciduous trees, there's plenty of light for them in winter, and then they go dormant anyway, so they don't care if they get much sun in the summertime.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Anybody else?
Thank you so much, Anne. This has been very, as always, informative and fun.
It is fun. And I go back to that quote again, like in spring, you should always smell like dirt. It's like, how it's been so frustrating when it's been cold and wet and dreary and nasty and you go out to garden and your hands turn blue. That's not fun. But now it's starting to get fun again. So this is a wonderful time to go refurbish your soil.
Your soul.
Soul. Both, right? Soul and soil together.
Thank you. Talk
Thank
to you
so
later.
much. That was wonderful.
Thank you.